Part 4, The Crimson Crossroads and Sonic Synthesis, 2010 to 2013. Chapter 31. The Creative Impasse After Speak Now. The guitar sits untouched in the corner of the Nashville studio, its neck catching a thin wedge of afternoon light that slants through the blinds. Taylor Swift stares at it for a long moment, not with longing, but with the particular unease of someone contemplating a door they are no longer certain they want to walk through. It is late 2011, and Speak Now has just concluded one of the most triumphant album cycles of her career. 35 weeks on the Billboard 200, a Grammy nomination for Album of the Year, a world tour that fills arenas from Auckland to Amsterdam. By every conventional measure, she has won. By the only measure that matters to her, she is standing still. The people around her notice it before she says it aloud. There is a restlessness that settles into her posture during writing sessions, a habit she develops of abandoning half-finished melodies mid-phrase and reaching for her phone to listen to something else entirely. Robin, Imogen Heap, the aggressive synth-out chorus structures flooding the pop radio dial. She is not escaping the room. She is auditing it, taking inventory of everything the room cannot give her. The culture pressing against the windows of that studio is electric and slightly unhinged in the way that only the early 2010s could manage. Katy Perry has just released Teenage Dream and redrawn the imaginative geography of pop femininity. Adele is selling grief to the masses with Baroque string arrangements and a voice that refuses apology. Lady Gaga is deconstructing celebrity in real time, wearing meat and theorizing performance art on morning television. The mainstream is fracturing into a dozen competing visions of what a woman with a microphone can be, and Taylor Swift, who has spent 4 years perfecting the country-inflected confessional, the acoustic intimacy, the handwritten bridge, finds herself staring at a landscape that no longer holds still long enough for her to aim. She is 22 years old, which is both very young and, in the compressed chronology of pop stardom, dangerously close to a kind of institutional middle age. The industry's metabolism is brutal in this way. Artists who define a moment too thoroughly risk becoming synonymous with it, fossilized inside their own greatest hits, before they have the biological age to apply for a car rental without a surcharge. Swift understands this with a clarity that unnerves some of the people around her. She does not want to be the queen of what she has already built. She wants to know if she can build something else. The conflict is not external, though the external pressures are real enough. Critics have begun to murmur about formula, about the predictable emotional arc of the Taylor Swift album experience. The wound examined, the wound transformed into a chorus. Music journalists, who admired her early work, are sharpening the particular kind of condescension reserved for artists who succeed on a scale that makes intellectual appreciation feel unsophisticated. There are whispers that she is a brand more than a musician, a marketing apparatus dressed in cowboy boots, that her songwriting is emotionally genuine but aesthetically safe. These assessments sting not because they are wholly accurate, but because they are not wholly wrong. The deeper conflict is internal and more difficult to name. She has built her entire creative identity on the premise of radical self-sufficiency. She writes her own songs, she directs her own narrative. She controls the story with a precision that leaves collaborators little room to steer. This has been her protection as much as her method. Every song she has released is irreducibly hers, traceable back to a specific wound or joy or observation she experienced firsthand. The guitar in the corner of the studio is not just an instrument. It is the emblem of an approach to music that kept her safe and made her great, and is now, she suspects, beginning to wall her in. What she needs is not a new producer in the conventional sense. She needs someone who will refuse to be managed. She finds him in Sweden, by reputation first and then by phone call, and then in a Stockholm studio that smells of coffee and soldering iron and the particular ozone quality of equipment that never gets powered down. Max Martin has spent 20 years shaping the architecture of pop music, from a building in Stockholm that most people on the street outside could not identify, producing hits for Backstreet Boys and Britney Spears and Pink and Katy Perry with a consistency that borders on the mathematical. He does not chase trends. He locates the structural DNA of what makes a song irresistible and builds from there, working at the molecular level of hook and rhythm and key change with the patience of someone who has no interest in being visible. He is the most powerful person in pop music, who does not appear in any pop music photograph. Their first writing session together, according to people who were present, is less a creative collaboration than a controlled experiment in mutual assessment. Swift arrives with melodies already sketched, her habitual preparation, the way she walks into rooms with more material than any single session can use. Martin listens with his head tilted slightly to one side, which is how he always listens, and then begins to take the melodies apart with a gentleness that nonetheless makes clear he is taking them apart. He is interested in the emotional architecture, but not necessarily in the walls she has chosen to hold it up. He suggests different chords, different production textures, a rhythmic approach to the verse that makes the same lyric land in an entirely different emotional register. What happens next is the thing that matters. Swift does not defer and she does not dig in. She argues. She engages the restructuring on its own terms, asking why at each juncture, demanding that the change justify itself not just sonically but narratively. Martin, who has worked with artists who treat the session as a service transaction, is apparently surprised and then visibly galvanized. The collaboration finds its footing, not in hierarchy, but in a kind of productive intellectual friction. Two people who are both completely certain they know what the song wants, negotiating with great specificity about where the song actually wants to go. This willingness to be challenged, to let someone technically more fluent in the language of pop production dismantle her constructions without experiencing it as a defeat, is perhaps the most revealing thing about who Taylor Swift is in this period. She has an ego that is large enough to survive being wrong in the room. She has the specific confidence of someone who is not threatened by excellence in others, because she is too busy trying to extract from it everything it can teach her. The songwriter who wrote every syllable of Speak Now alone, as a deliberate act of artistic independence, sits across from Max Martin and lets him show her something about her own songs she did not know was there. This is not weakness. This is a different and arguably rarer form of stubbornness, the stubbornness that refuses to stop learning. Shellback, Martin's longtime collaborator, rounds out the triangle of the new creative arrangement, bringing a production sensibility that is simultaneously bombastic and precise, capable of manufacturing the feeling of enormity within a track structure that is technically immaculate. The three of them begin building what will eventually become the sonic signature of Red. Not the whole album, which remains a hybrid organism, half country and half something harder to classify, but the moments that announce the new direction most clearly. We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together arrives out of this collaboration like a declaration of intent disguised as a breakup song. Its spoken word bridge and propulsive pop structure, as far from the acoustic vulnerability of White Horse as it is possible to travel while still recognizably belonging to the same emotional universe. The relationship between Swift and Martin is not a mentorship, though it is easy to mistake it for one given the disparity in years and industry experience. It is closer to a mutual recognition, two people who take the craft of the pop song with a seriousness that the broader culture often refuses to extend to the genre, finding in each other a collaborator who understands that the 3-minute radio song is not a lesser form but a compression, a discipline, a kind of sonnet with a 4/4 time signature. Swift brings the emotional raw material, the autobiographical specificity, the narrative instinct that gives even the most produced track a human center. Martin and Shellback bring the architecture, the production vocabulary, the understanding of how to make something feel both massive and intimate at radio volume. Neither is sufficient without the other, which is the particular beauty of the collaboration and also what makes it, for Swift, slightly destabilizing. She has always been sufficient unto herself. Now she is discovering what sufficiency of a different and larger kind might feel like. The recording of Red takes place across multiple studios and multiple collaborators over the better part of a year, and the album that emerges in October 2012 is consequently a document of a self in genuine transition, which is to say, it is sometimes magnificent and sometimes uneven in the way that only sincere artistic risk produces. It is too long, critics will say, and they will be right, and it will not matter in the least. The title track is a synesthetic inventory of emotional intensity, color mapped onto feeling in a way that is simultaneously simple and technically sophisticated. All Too Well is 10 minutes of memory reconstructed with such novelistic precision that it becomes a kind of argument about what pop songwriting is capable of. An argument Taylor Swift has been assembling her entire career, but which here reaches a level of sustained achievement that even her most skeptical observers find difficult to dismiss. The album sells over 1 million copies in its first week in the United States, making Swift the first female artist to have multiple albums achieve that milestone. The country establishment, which has watched her drift toward pop with a complicated mixture of pride and unease, receives the news with the particular ambivalence of a parent watching a child leave for a city they don't entirely trust. The pop establishment receives the album as a provisional arrival, welcoming but not yet fully convinced. Swift occupies, for the length of the Red era, a genuinely unprecedented position in American music, too pop for country, too country for pop, too successful for anyone to articulate their discomfort too loudly. She performs We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together at the 2013 Grammy Awards with a stagecraft confidence that belongs to a different phase of her evolution. The production values of a headlining stadium act, the physical ease of someone who has spent enough time on enormous stages that they have become her natural habitat. Backstage afterward, according to people who were there, she is already talking about what comes next, already pulling at the threads of what Red has made possible rather than resting inside what it has achieved. The restlessness has not been resolved by the album. It has been educated. There is something she understands now that she did not understand before Stockholm. The song does not belong to the process that made it. The acoustic guitar, the country radio format, the Nashville writer's room, these are methods, not identities. The identity is the thing underneath, the emotional and narrative intelligence that makes the song cohere regardless of what instruments carry it. This is either a liberating insight or an enormously dangerous one. Possibly both. What she does not yet know, cannot know, standing in the Grammy afterglow with the particular confidence of someone who has just successfully navigated a major creative crossing, is that the negotiation she has begun with the machinery of pop music is also a negotiation with the machinery of fame itself, and that the terms of that negotiation are already being written in rooms she has not been invited to enter. Chapter 32. Enter Max Martin and Shellback. The elevator doors open onto a corridor that smells of recycled air and something faintly chemical, the particular atmosphere of a recording studio scrubbed clean of daylight. It is Stockholm in the deep winter of 2012, and Taylor Swift stands at the threshold of Maritone Studios, holding a notebook so densely annotated it has begun to curl at the corners, its spine cracked from the pressure of too many urgent revisions made in too many airplane seats. She is 22 years old. She has sold more than 20 million albums. And she is terrified. Not of the city. Stockholm's ordered geometry, its amber street lamps reflected on black water, has a kind of austere peace she finds clarifying rather than cold. The terror is quieter and more precise than geography. It lives in the particular arithmetic of what she is about to do: walk into a room with the two men who have, between them, constructed the architecture of modern pop music, and ask to be remade. Or rather, and this distinction matters enormously to her, to be expanded. She carries the notebook against her chest like a breastplate, and she steps into the corridor, and the door closes behind her. The pop landscape she is entering in those early years of the decade is one in thrall to a specific kind of manufactured immediacy. The charts of 2011 and 2012 belong to production that feels colossal in its ambitions and almost algorithmic in its execution. Maximalist drops, synthetic textures layered with the obsessiveness of a watchmaker, hooks engineered to bloom in the first 8 seconds or be abandoned. Streaming has not yet fully reorganized the economics of the industry, but its logic is already bending the culture. Attention is the scarcest commodity, and the producers who command it most reliably are not working from guitar chords and a yellow legal pad in Nashville. They are working in Stockholm. The broader cultural moment in which Swift finds herself is one of pronounced transition for women in American pop. Beyoncé has spent the previous year moving towards something dense and self-referential, a catalog of ambition that will eventually crystallize into a conceptual monument. Rihanna releases music with the relentlessness of someone burning documents. Adele's 21 has demonstrated that unadorned emotional weight can generate seismic commercial response, and its success becomes, paradoxically, a kind of pressure on every other artist, proof that the market will reward genuine feeling, but only if that feeling is packaged with impeccable craft. The question hanging over every label meeting, every A&R conversation, every late-night phone call between managers and songwriters is the same: what does a 21st century pop record actually require? Authenticity has become a genre. Vulnerability has become a production technique. Swift has read this landscape with the attentiveness she brings to everything. She has watched it the way she watched the Nashville gatekeepers at 11 years old, learning not to be intimidated, but to be strategic, to identify what a room respects and then demonstrate that she possesses it in surplus. What she has concluded, after Speak Now and its critical reception, is that her instinct for narrative and her facility for melody are assets that transcend genre, but that she has been operating in a sonic vocabulary that is beginning to feel like a room she has already memorized. She does not want to leave country music so much as she wants to discover what she becomes when its walls are removed. The obstacle is not simply aesthetic. It is structural, and it involves a tension that will define the following 2 years of her working life. Swift's creative identity has been built on a very specific promise, one she has made not in contracts, but in the texture of every album she has released. The promise is this: that what you hear is what she felt, that the bridge she wrote in the back of a tour bus about a specific boy in a specific month is reaching you unmediated, with its original grain intact. Country music as a genre has been the enabling condition of that promise, because country music, more than almost any other popular form, valorizes the confessional mode. The singer writes the song. The song tells the truth. The listener believes. Pop music, in the register in which Max Martin and Shellback operate, functions differently. Its genius is not confessional, but architectural. The emotion it produces is real, but the craft that produces it is unsentimental, modular, almost surgical. Martin, born Martin Carl Sandberg in Stockholm in 1971, has spent 3 decades studying the geometry of the hook with the rigor of a mathematician who believes there are correct answers. His collaborations with Shellback, Johann Schuster, a decade younger, whose ear for contemporary texture perfectly complements Martin's classical melodic instinct, have generated a run of pop productions in the years immediately preceding Swift's arrival that represent perhaps the purest expression of what Swedish pop craftsmanship can achieve. They are not interested in authenticity as an ideology. They are interested in the moment a melody does something unexpected, and the listener's breath catches. This is the irreconcilable tension Swift carries into Maratone. She needs their architecture, and they need her autobiography. The question is whether those two things can be made to coexist without one destroying the other. What happens in the first session is, by all subsequent accounts, unexpected in its velocity. Martin has worked with enough artists to have developed a finely calibrated sense of where the productive friction lives in a collaboration, and he locates it almost immediately. Swift arrives with fragments, melodic sketches, lyrical phrases, the emotional coordinates of several unfinished songs, and what she discovers in the first hours of working with Martin and Schuster is that they do not wish to replace her fragments. They wish to build load-bearing walls around them. Martin's method is accretive and surprisingly patient. He does not impose a sound so much as identify what a song is already reaching toward, and then remove every obstacle between the song and its destination. The specific session that will later be understood as the turning point concerns an early version of what will become I Knew You Were Trouble. Swift has a verse and a chorus. The emotional logic is completely in place. The story of a self-aware capitulation to someone she already knows will cost her, but the production she has imagined for it is, by her own later admission, still operating within a framework that feels safe. Martin listens to what she has and says very little for a moment. Then he asks her a question that is, in the way of his best interventions, also a provocation. What does the worst decision you've ever made sound like? She does not answer immediately. But the answer, when the session resumes the following day, is embedded in the dubstep-influenced drop that becomes the production's most startling element. A sound that feels like the moment a rational mind overrides itself, the specific frequency of doing something you cannot explain. It is not a country sound. It is not precisely any sound she has made before. But it carries her fingerprint in every syllable of its lyric. And what Martin and Schuster have done is not replace her voice, but amplify its frequency into a register she did not previously know she occupied. This distinction between translation and amplification becomes the governing principle of every session that follows, and it matters because it resolves, at least provisionally, the authenticity problem. Swift returns to Nashville between Stockholm visits with recordings that she plays for the collaborators she trusts most, watching their faces for the specific response she is calibrating toward, recognition. She needs the people who know her to hear her in these new productions. When they do, when a co-writer or a producer who has known her for years listens to a Stockholm session and says, without prompting, "That sounds like you," she files it as evidence. She's building a case. The relationship with Martin and Schuster is the primary new force in her professional life during this window, but it operates alongside an existing one that is, in its own way, being transformed. Nathan Chapman, who has produced every album she has made, understands what the Stockholm sessions mean before she has to explain it, and his response to that understanding says something essential about his character. He does not protect his position. He expands his role instead, becoming the figure who helps translate between the two sonic worlds she is now navigating simultaneously, who can hear a Martin production and identify where its emotional vocabulary aligns with the one they have developed together over nearly a decade. Chapman's security in himself makes Swift's expansion possible. An insecure collaborator would have introduced friction at the exact moment she needed fluidity. What he offers instead is continuity, a connective tissue between who she has been and who she is in the process of becoming. There is a moment, documented in the oral history of Red's creation, assembled from interviews given years after its release, that functions as a kind of compression of everything the Stockholm collaboration achieved and everything it cost. Swift is in the studio listening back to a completed track, not Trouble, but another production from the sessions whose identity she has kept slightly guarded over the years, and the playback ends, and the room is quiet, and she says to no one in particular, "I don't know if my fans will follow me here." It is not a question exactly. It is more like a person taking an inventory of what they are risking. Martin, according to the account, says nothing in response. He simply cues the track again from the beginning and lets the music answer for itself. This is the texture of the creative risk she is taking, and it is worth being precise about its nature. Swift is not, in 2012, an artist in commercial decline who needs reinvention as a survival strategy. She is, by every metric the industry uses to measure such things, at the height of her generational dominance. The risk she is taking is therefore not the risk of someone with nothing to lose. It is the far more vertiginous risk of someone choosing to endanger something real, a specific relationship with a specific audience built over a decade of earned trust, in pursuit of a version of herself that she can see clearly but has not yet been allowed to inhabit. The distinction between those two kinds of risk is the distinction between necessity and desire as a motivating force is harder to explain and harder to defend, and Swift has always known this, which is part of why the notebook in her hands has curled at the corners. Red, when it is released in October 2012, becomes the fastest-selling album of her career to that point. It sells 1.2 million copies in its first week in the United States alone, a number that briefly renders irrelevant the question of whether the pop pivot has cost her anything with her existing audience. The reviews are, in the aggregate, the most enthusiastic of her career. Critics who have previously treated her as a demographic phenomenon rather than an artistic one arrive at Red and find themselves writing sentences they had not expected to write, using words like daring and restless and genuinely surprising. The album operates across such a range of sonic territory that it almost defies categorization, which is precisely the point, and which will eventually become, in critical retrospect, both its greatest achievement and its most discussed liability. But in October 2012, none of that retrospect has yet accumulated, and what Swift experiences in the album's first days of release is something that, by the evidence of everything she says and writes in that period, she did not fully allow herself to anticipate: the discovery that her audience followed her. Not all of them, and not without question, but the essential core, the listeners who had built their relationship with her on the premise that she was someone who told the truth, recognized the truth in the new productions, heard her fingerprint in every lyric that Martin and Schuster had amplified into a register she had not previously occupied. The case she had been building was accepted. She will spend the next 2 years on the road with Red, performing its songs in arenas she is filling with a demographic that is expanding even as she watches it, skewing older, bringing in listeners who have come to her not through country radio but through the sonic territory the Stockholm sessions opened. And in those arenas, in the space between what she has made and what the crowd returns to her, she is already calculating, already listening, already writing things down in notebooks that have not yet begun to curl. The Stockholm sessions have given her what she came for. What she does not yet understand, cannot yet understand, is that in solving one problem, she has set another one in motion, because the audience that follows her into pop is larger than the one she left behind, and larger audiences generate larger pressures, and larger pressures eventually demand a response that no notebook, however densely annotated, can fully prepare her for. Chapter 33. The Sonic Collage of Red. The tape is running before anyone says a word. In the winter of 2011, inside a Nashville studio whose walls are lined with the kind of acoustic foam that swallows sound the way snow swallows footsteps, Taylor Swift sits cross-legged on a leather couch with a yellow legal pad balanced on her knee. She is 21 years old, and she is surrounded by silence that she is clearly trying to fill. The legal pad is already dense with notation, not musical notation exactly, more like emotional cartography, phrases circled and connected with arrows, words underlined twice and then underlined again. Someone in the room, a producer, an engineer, a session player, says something about key signatures. She doesn't look up. Her pen keeps moving. Whatever is happening on that legal pad is the real session. The music will come second. This image, reported by collaborators who were present during the early sketches of what would eventually become Red, captures something essential about the method behind one of the most structurally audacious records a major label country artist had ever attempted to make. It was not a record born from genre ambition alone. It was born from emotional overload, from the specific, almost unbearable feeling of being 21 and heartbroken in public, of loving people who left and leaving people who loved you, and of doing all of it in front of an audience of millions who had decided years earlier that your personal life was their property. The yellow legal pad was not a songwriting tool. It was a pressure valve. By the time Taylor Swift began assembling Red in earnest through 2011 and into 2012, the cultural landscape she inhabited had undergone a tectonic reorganization. The music industry that had nurtured her debut in 2006, physical album sales, country radio gatekeeping, the slow accumulation of touring credibility, had been replaced by something faster, noisier, and far less forgiving. Streaming was not yet dominant, but digital singles had shattered the album's monopoly on commercial narrative. Artists like Adele had demonstrated that emotional directness could cross every genre boundary imaginable, while acts like Skrillex and Diplo had made electronic production not merely acceptable but fashionably urgent. The pop landscape of 2012 was a hall of mirrors. Everything reflected everything else, and the most commercially successful music was the music that could live comfortably in multiple reflections at once. For Swift, this moment arrived with a particular kind of pressure that had no real precedent in her career. Speak Now, released in 2010, had been a deliberate act of authorial self-assertion, an album she wrote entirely alone, without a single co-writer, a choice that read simultaneously as artistic mission statement and defensive maneuver against critics who had questioned whether she truly wrote her own material. It had sold magnificently and vindicated her publicly. But the very completeness of that vindication created a new problem. She had proven she could do it alone. The question now was whether doing it alone was still the most interesting version of herself she could offer. Whether the walls she had built for protection had also become walls that limited her range. The core conflict embedded in the creation of Red was not, despite what some observers assumed at the time, a question of commercial calculation. It was a question of identity elasticity, of how far a carefully constructed artistic persona could stretch before it either transformed into something new or snapped back into its original shape. Swift understood, with the kind of self-awareness she had been cultivating since she was a teenager studying the music business from the inside, that she was standing at a junction where the path forward required her to risk the thing she had most carefully protected, the coherence of her creative voice. She made a decision that, in retrospect, seems both obvious and radical. She would not choose a direction. She would contain all of them. The sessions that produced Red became something genuinely unusual in contemporary pop production. A deliberate, orchestrated collision of worlds that were not supposed to share studio space. She worked with Nathan Chapman, her longtime collaborator, on tracks that honored the acoustic intimacy of her earliest recordings. She flew to Stockholm to work with Max Martin and Shellback, the Swedish production duo, whose fingerprints were on some of the most architecturally precise pop music of the previous decade. She collaborated with Jeff Bhaskar, whose production vocabulary included the kind of electronic textures that felt borrowed from entirely different cultural ecosystems. She worked with Dan Wilson, who had written Someone Like You with Adele, importing the piano and devastation emotional register that Adele had made definitional. She worked with Jackknife Lee, an Irish producer whose background ran from alternative rock to post-punk, whose instincts were congenitally opposed to the clean narrative resolution that country music traditionally demanded. The resulting album sounds, on first listen, like it cannot possibly be a single coherent object. State of Grace opens with electric guitars borrowed from Springsteen and U2, stadium-sized and anthemic, the kind of sound that feels like it was built to be heard from the upper deck. We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together is bubblegum architecture, a pop song so precisely constructed that its catchiness feels almost aggressive, a hook that lodges in the brain and refuses eviction. Treacherous is acoustic and interior, almost whispering. I Knew You Were Trouble arrives with a dubstep-influenced drop that, in 2012, felt genuinely dissonant in the context of her catalog. A borrowing from a production language associated with sweaty nightclubs and anonymous euphoria, applied to the very personal, very specific emotional terrain of romantic catastrophe. All Too Well is something else entirely. A 5-minute, 30-second folk narrative of such granular emotional precision that it operates less like a pop song and more like a short story, every detail, the scarf, the September light, the birthday, carrying the specific weight of something that actually happened. The question of whether these songs belonged on the same album was asked repeatedly, including by people within her own professional circle. The answer Swift gave, when she gave it at all, was characteristically direct. She said the album was about the experience of being 21 and feeling everything too much, of living inside a series of emotional extremes that didn't resolve into a single tone, and that the sonic variety was not a flaw in the record's logic but the point of it. Chaos, she suggested, was the most honest available structure. It was during the Red Sessions that her working relationship with Max Martin began to crystallize into something more than a single collaboration. A professional kinship that would quietly reshape the next chapter of her career in ways neither party may have fully anticipated. Martin, who had spent 2 decades engineering some of the most commercially dominant pop music in the world, from the Backstreet Boys to Britney Spears to Katy Perry, brought to their collaboration a production intelligence that was almost the inverse of Swift's. Where she worked from emotion outward, drafting feeling and then finding the sound that matched it, Martin worked architecturally, constructing sonic frames with almost mathematical precision, and then populating them with the melodic and lyrical content that made them feel human. The tension between these two methods, between her outside-in emotional approach and his inside-out structural approach, produced something that neither would have made independently. What Martin seemed to recognize in Swift, and what he has alluded to in subsequent interviews without ever quite stating directly, was that beneath the country girl presentation and the confessional lyrical instinct was a songwriter with an unusually sophisticated understanding of pop architecture. She could feel a hook before she could articulate why it worked. She knew when a pre-chorus was earning the release of a chorus and when it was merely marking time. She had been studying the mechanics of pop music since she was 12, absorbing the grammar of mainstream radio with the same systematic attention she brought to everything else. Martin, who had worked with artists who were primarily performers and needed his production to supply most of the compositional intelligence, found himself working with someone who was already thinking about structure before the session began. It changed the nature of what he did in the room with her. Their collaboration on We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together and I Knew You Were Trouble represented something more significant than 2 commercially successful singles. It was the beginning of a translation process, the patient, methodical work of building a bridge between the emotional vocabulary she had developed in Nashville and the sonic vocabulary of global pop. The bridge would not be completed on Red. The album's genre sprawl was evidence of construction still in progress, the sound of someone who has gathered all the materials but has not yet decided the final form of the structure. But the foundation was being laid, one session at a time, in studios on 2 continents. Red was released in October 2012, and sold 1.2 million copies in its first week in the United States alone, becoming the fastest-selling album by a female artist in more than a decade. The reviews were, in their way, as structurally fragmented as the record itself. Critics praised some tracks with genuine fervor and dismissed others as genre tourism, often within the same review, as though the album's internal variety was a provocation the critical apparatus was not equipped to handle as a unified argument. The country establishment, which had been her professional home and her launching pad, received it with a complicated mixture of pride and unease, recognizing that she was not making a country album, while also recognizing that she was not entirely leaving them behind. She was doing something stranger and more difficult. She was occupying multiple genre identities simultaneously, refusing to resolve into any single one. In interviews around the album's release, Swift was careful about how she characterized what she had done. She called Red her most honest record, which was true. She talked about the emotional range of the material, which was accurate. What she did not say, or did not say directly, was that the album was also a laboratory, a space in which she was testing at commercial scale what she was capable of becoming. Every sonic departure on Red was also a measurement, a way of finding the outer edges of her range and discovering which expansions felt like authentic extension and which felt like costume. The dubstep drop in "I Knew You Were Trouble" was not a permanent address. It was a door she was opening to see what was on the other side. She kept the yellow legal pads. Years later, collaborators would remember them as a constant, through line across studios and cities and wildly different production environments. The same dense, circled, arrow-connected emotional cartography, the same commitment to getting the feeling right before anything else. The sounds changed. The instruments changed. The producers changed. The pad stayed. What no one in those sessions could see, watching her sit cross-legged on studio couches with her pen moving before the tape rolled, was that the sonic collage of Red was not the destination. It was the education. She was learning in real time, at the speed of a #1 album and a sold-out arena tour, which pieces of the future she was building actually belonged to her, and the conclusions she was quietly reaching would not stay quiet for long. Chapter 34. The songwriting architecture of All Too Well. She sits at the piano in a rented Nashville studio in the autumn of 2011, and the room is almost embarrassingly quiet. The engineers have stepped out. The overhead fluorescents have been dimmed to something warmer, more amber, the kind of light that makes a room feel like a memory even while you are still inside it. Taylor Swift is 21 years old, and she is holding a scrap of notebook paper covered in handwriting so dense it seems to breathe. She does not play anything yet. She reads. She crosses out a word, writes another, crosses that one out too. Outside the studio glass, Nashville is doing what Nashville always does, humming with commerce, with ambition, with the quiet grinding machinery of the music industry, but in here something different is happening. Something that does not yet have a name. The notebook page will eventually become a song. But not a song in the conventional sense, not a 3-minute radio unit engineered for the back half of a playlist. What Taylor Swift is building in this amber silence is closer to a short story, or a confession, or a wound that has been pressed flat between the pages of a diary and preserved long past the point where it should have been allowed to heal. She will call it All Too Well. And by the time the world hears it, it will have been reduced by almost half from its original length, a fact that will quietly torment her for the better part of a decade. But that is a consequence that lives somewhere in the future. Right now, there is only the notebook page, the crossed-out words, the amber light. By 2011, the cultural pressure on Taylor Swift was not the ordinary pressure of a young artist finding her footing. It was something more structural, more institutional, and in certain respects more insidious. She had arrived in the popular imagination as a country prodigy, a teenage girl who wrote her own songs, played her own guitar, and possessed an instinct for melodic storytelling that even her most skeptical critics were forced eventually to acknowledge. But the music industry, particularly in the early part of that decade, operated according to a logic of categorical containment. You were country or you were pop. You were authentic or you were commercial. You were an artist or you were a product. These distinctions were enforced not just by genre gatekeepers, but by listeners themselves, and by the media apparatus that shaped what listeners believed they wanted. Taylor Swift had already begun to strain against those categories. Her third album, Speak Now, released in 2010, was entirely self-written. A pointed statement of creative ownership at a moment when the Nashville establishment was still quietly skeptical of whether a 20-year-old girl could sustain that kind of output without a room full of professional songwriters propping her up. The album had sold spectacularly, but the critical conversation around her remained frustratingly narrow. She was praised for her relatability, for her diary entry confessionalism, for her ability to capture the emotional texture of high school hallways and breakup texts. What she was rarely praised for, what almost no critic in that period was willing to say plainly, was that she was formally gifted, that her structural instincts as a songwriter were sophisticated in ways that exceeded her years and exceeded the genre. She knew this. She had always known it, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent her entire adolescence being underestimated. And Red, the album she was beginning to assemble in this period, was her attempt to make that sophistication undeniable. Not by announcing it, by embodying it. The core conflict at the heart of this creative moment was not about genre, though genre would be the language in which the conflict was publicly debated. It was about permission. The question Taylor Swift was wrestling with, alone in that amber studio light, was whether she was allowed to write something genuinely difficult. Not difficult in a provocative or transgressive sense. Difficult in the literary sense, dense with implication, structurally layered, emotionally unresolved. Country radio in 2011 had precise parameters for what a song was supposed to do. It was supposed to arrive at a feeling, deliver it cleanly, and release the listener. Resolution was not optional. Resolution was the contract. All Too Well violated that contract in almost every particular. It did not resolve. It circled. It returned to its central image, a scarf left at a former lover's sister's house, a piece of fabric so charged with memory that its absence becomes a presence, with the kind of obsessive recursiveness you find in Fitzgerald rather than in Billboard singles. Its structure refused the usual architecture of verse-chorus-verse. The bridge, when it arrived, was not a bridge in any functional sense, but a rupture. A place where the song's accumulated emotional pressure finally exceeded the vessel, and the narrators stopped narrating and started accusing. In 7 minutes, the original version was longer still. Swift built something that functioned less like a radio song, and less like a country song than like a short story, by someone who had read too much and felt too much and had not yet learned or chosen to care about the difference. The keyhole moment, the revealing action that unlocks the larger character at work here, came not in the final recording, but in the writing sessions themselves, specifically in a creative session with her frequent collaborator Jake Lacy and the producer Jeff Bhaskar in the late summer of 2011. Swift had arrived with fragments, images, emotional beats, pieces of melody that felt urgent to her but not yet connected. What emerged in that session was the discovery that the fragments did not need to be smoothed into coherence. They needed to remain fragments. The scarf, the refrigerator light, the autumn leaves. These were not images chosen for their symbolic neatness. They were chosen because they were the actual texture of a specific memory, and their specificity was precisely their power. Swift made the decision, unusual, risky, and in retrospect revelatory, to trust the images more than the narrative. To let the song be messy in the way that memory is messy, non-linear, obsessive, unfair. This was the decision of an artist who understood something that most commercial songwriters spend their careers avoiding, that emotional precision and emotional tidiness are not the same thing, and that the former is almost always more powerful than the latter. The scarf that reappears in the song's final moments is not a symbol in the undergraduate literature class sense. It is evidence. It is the physical remainder of a relationship that has been officially erased, and its continued existence in the sister's house indicts the person who kept it. Swift does not say this. She does not need to. The image says it, and the image says it in a way that no amount of direct statement could replicate. She was, in the writing of this song, functioning as a novelist. The relationship that anchored this creative period, the one that animated not just All Too Well, but much of Red's emotional architecture, was her involvement with Jake Gyllenhaal, the actor she had dated briefly in the autumn of 2010 and into early 2011. This relationship has been dissected with a thoroughness that borders on the forensic, particularly in the decade that followed, and it is not the province of this chapter to adjudicate what happened or to assign moral weight to either party. What is relevant here is the creative function the relationship served. It provided what all great songwriting subjects provide: a set of experiences so specific in their sensory detail that they resisted the generalizing pressure of the lyric form. The age gap, he was approximately 10 years her senior, the social asymmetry, the particular quality of feeling young and certain of your feelings in the company of someone older who treats that certainty as naivete. These were not abstract emotional conditions. They had textures. They had specific rooms and specific lights and specific moments of misrecognition. All Too Well captures these textures with an exactitude that makes the listener feel, uncomfortably and intimately, that they are reading someone's private correspondence. This is not an accident of inspiration. It is the result of deliberate craft, of a songwriter who had learned, by this point in her career, that the universal is most reliably reached through the hyper-specific, that the song that makes a listener feel recognized is almost always the song that was written about something very particular to the writer. Gyllenhaal's role in this chapter is not biographical gossip. He is, more precisely, the occasion, the trigger for a creative act that exceeded the relationship itself by an enormous margin. The song's production, overseen in its final form by Jeff Bhaskar with contributions from Nathan Chapman, Swift's longtime Nashville collaborator, made a choice that was as significant as any lyrical decision. It remained acoustic. In a period when Swift was actively beginning her migration towards synthesized pop production, a migration that would accelerate dramatically with 1989, 3 years later, All Too Well was recorded with an almost conspicuous restraint. Piano, acoustic guitar, a string arrangement that arrived late in the song and swelled with the precision of something long held rather than something deployed. The production refused to do what the lyrics refused to do. It refused to tidy up. The instrumentation stayed out of the way of the feeling, which is the rarest and most difficult discipline in commercial record making. The album Red, released in October 2012, was in retrospect one of the most formally interesting commercial records of its decade. A double album in everything but official structure, running to 16 tracks in its standard form and expanding further in deluxe editions. It contained straight-ahead country. It contained Max Martin-produced pop so pure and propulsive it felt beamed in from a different creative organism entirely. It contained guitar-driven rock. And then, tucked near the album's end, running at just over 5 minutes in its edited form, it contained All Too Well. Critics who engaged seriously with the record recognized the song as something anomalous. Rolling Stone placed it near the top of their year-end lists, and a small number of reviewers were willing to use the word masterpiece in proximity to a 22-year-old's breakup song. The broader public heard it with the recognition of people who had felt something similar but had never found the language for it. But the version on Red was not the version Taylor Swift had written. The original recording, reportedly running to approximately 10 minutes, had been edited for the album release. The cuts were practical: radio formats, album sequencing, the commercial realities that govern even the most artistically ambitious major label releases. Swift agreed to the edit. She understood the logic. But she did not forget what had been removed, and the removed material lived in her creative consciousness with the persistent presence of the scarf in the song itself, evidence of something that had existed, undeniable even in its absence. This is the quiet undercurrent that runs beneath the remarkable commercial and critical achievement of Red's release. The album was a crossroads record, and Swift navigated its contradictions with a strategic intelligence that her critics frequently mistook for opportunism. She was not abandoning country to chase pop. She was building an argument in real time, across 16 tracks, that the genre categories were insufficient to contain what she was actually doing. The pop collaborations with Max Martin and Shellback, which produced tracks like We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together and 22, were not defections from her artistic core. They were demonstrations of range, and range in a female artist at that precise cultural moment was consistently misread as inconsistency. She was not inconsistent. She was capacious. And the distinction would take years, a full decade in some critical quarters, to be properly understood. Red debuted at number 1 in 17 countries. It sold over 1 million copies in its first week in the United States alone, making Swift the only artist to achieve that milestone multiple times in the SoundScan era. The numbers confirmed what the music had already demonstrated. She had expanded her audience rather than fractured it. The crossover was not a gamble that had paid off. It was a calculation, executed with an exactitude that would have been striking in an executive twice her age. But even as the album's success settled into record book permanence, something was shifting in the cultural atmosphere around Taylor Swift in ways that had less to do with music than with the machinery of celebrity. She was becoming, in the public imagination, a figure whose romantic life was its own narrative industry, her relationships tracked and tabulated by a media ecosystem that had discovered with the reliable instinct of a predator sensing vulnerability, that her willingness to write autobiographically about personal experience could be converted into a form of surveillance. Every relationship became a countdown to the song it would produce. Every breakup became a kind of harvest. She had helped build this dynamic, at least in part, by writing with the transparency she did. But the implications of what she had helped build were only beginning in the winter of 2012 to become visible. Somewhere ahead, the scrutiny would curdle into something uglier, and the open-heartedness that was her greatest artistic weapon would be turned against her in ways she could not yet fully anticipate, by critics, by the internet, by a public that had not yet learned the difference between knowing an artist and owning one. Chapter 35. The Serial Dater, Caricature, and Media Misrepresentation. She sits in the back of a black SUV somewhere between Nashville and nowhere, the city lights smearing past the tinted windows like watercolors left in the rain. It is late 2012, and Taylor Swift is holding a legal pad against her knee, a pen moving across it in the particular furious shorthand she has used since she was 12 years old, the kind of writing that happens when the mind outpaces the hand and the heart outpaces both. Outside, a radio station somewhere in Middle America is playing We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together, and the irony of hearing your own voice tell you something you already know is not lost on her. She does not look up. The pen keeps moving. There is a version of this moment that the press would construct for public consumption over the next several months, and it has almost nothing to do with the legal pad. In that version, she is lovelorn, reckless, a young woman cycling through famous men the way other people cycle through seasons, leaving wreckage and verse in equal measure. It is a tidy story. It is also, in almost every meaningful way, a fiction, one assembled from tabloid fragments and late-night punchlines, and a cultural appetite for narratives that reduce ambitious women to their romantic histories. The real story, the one playing out in the back of that SUV with the legal pad and the leaking city light, is about something far more interesting than heartbreak. It is about transformation. By the time Taylor Swift entered the studio sessions that would produce Red, she had already done something that most artists working in the popular music landscape of the early 2010s had not managed. She had built a self-sustaining creative ecosystem almost entirely from the inside out. 3 consecutive platinum albums, sold-out arena tours, a Grammy for Album of the Year before she turned 20. These were not small achievements in a generous era. They were extraordinary feats in a music industry contracting sharply under the pressure of digital disruption, streaming's early insurgency, and a radio environment increasingly hostile to anything that did not fit a pre-established algorithmic template. The industry around her was fracturing. She was building. But the world was watching something else entirely. The cultural moment she occupied, between 2010 and 2013, was one shaped by a particular and well-documented double standard, the same one that had been applied to female artists for generations, but which found new velocity in the social media age, where opinion could be manufactured and amplified within hours. A male artist in his early 20s, who wrote prolifically about romantic experience, was a poet, a troubadour, a sensitive soul mining his pain for universal truth. Taylor Swift, writing from precisely the same emotional material with arguably greater craft and demonstrably larger commercial impact, was labeled a problem. The label serial dater, that diminishing almost clinical construction, began appearing in celebrity gossip columns and then migrated, as these things do, into more legitimate press. Saturday Night Live ran a sketch. A presenter at the Golden Globes made a joke. The joke was about her love life. The audience laughed. She sat in the front row and smiled the smile of someone who has learned, very early, that the only response available to her in that particular arena is grace. What the joke missed, what the sketch missed, what the tabloid infrastructure of that entire period missed with almost choreographed consistency, was the obvious and essential fact: the relationships were the research. The experiences she was living and writing about were not distractions from her art. They were the art. She had said as much, repeatedly, in interviews that were then selectively edited to confirm the narrative already in motion. "I write songs about my life," she told one interviewer in 2012, with a patience that must have required considerable effort, the same way any songwriter does. The interviewer moved on to ask about the next boyfriend. It was within this climate, dismissive, reductive, and insistently personal in the worst possible way, that she made the creative decision that would define the next decade of her career. If the world was going to flatten her into a caricature, regardless of the complexity she brought to her work, then she would use that complexity to blow the walls out entirely. The production team she assembled for Red reflected this instinct with precision. She had worked before with Nathan Chapman, her longtime collaborator, and the man who had helped her build the sonic architecture of her first 3 albums. She did not abandon Chapman. She expanded the table dramatically, bringing in Shellback and Max Martin, the Swedish production duo whose fingerprints were on some of the most precisely engineered pop music of the preceding 2 decades. The decision to work with Martin in particular was not accidental and not casual. It was a deliberate act of creative positioning. A young artist studying the mechanisms of a different genre with the same seriousness she had once applied to country storytelling. She arrived at those sessions having already listened exhaustively to what Martin had built with other artists, the architecture of the hooks, the way he compressed emotional content into 3.5 minutes without sacrificing it. She came prepared. By most accounts from those sessions, she came better prepared than anyone expected. What emerged from that collaboration was not a pop album wearing country clothing, nor a country album that had wandered into the wrong studio. Red was something genuinely difficult to categorize, which was itself a kind of argument. The album moved between genres, with the confidence of an artist who understood that the lines between them were largely administrative. State of Grace opened with the distorted guitar surge of stadium rock. I Knew You Were Trouble carried the pulse of electronic dance music beneath its narrative of self-recrimination. All Too Well, 10 minutes in its original form, eventually released in that form a decade later, was something closer to a short story set to acoustic guitar, the kind of writing that recalled not pop songcraft, but the emotional granularity of literary fiction. The 10-minute version of that song alone represented a rebuke to every critic who had spent 2 years suggesting her work was thin. The critical establishment received Red with a split reaction that itself illuminated the bind she occupied. Reviewers who were inclined to take her seriously praised the ambition and the range. Others, working within the same reductive framework as the tabloids, treated the album as evidence of disorder rather than design, as though the emotional breadth of the record was confirmation that she was undisciplined rather than proof that she was operating at a level of creative simultaneity most of her peers could not match. The commercial reception settled the argument by the only metric the industry reliably respects. Red sold over 1 million copies in its first week in the United States alone, making Swift one of the few artists of her generation to accomplish that feat with any album, let alone her fourth. But the private cost of the caricature was real, and those around her during this period understood it in ways that did not make it into the press releases. Her mother, Andrea Swift, who had been diagnosed with cancer during this period, a fact Taylor kept largely out of the public record for years out of protective instinct, remained the gravitational center of her daughter's life. Andrea was not simply a parent who attended shows. She was the person in the room who told the truth when everyone else was telling Taylor what she wanted to hear. And sometimes more importantly, the person who reminded her that the noise was not the signal. In conversations recalled by people close to both women, Andrea functioned as a kind of emotional editor, not softening what Taylor was experiencing, but helping her understand the difference between what was actually happening and what the world was performing around her. This relationship, forged in the peculiar crucible of extraordinary early fame, would prove to be one of the most consequential of Taylor's life, precisely because it gave her a fixed point when the rest of the landscape kept shifting. There was a specific moment during the 2013 promotional cycle for Red that functioned, for those who understood it, as a keyhole into the larger architecture of how she processed public misrepresentation. She was doing a round of press interviews, the kind of day that requires a person to answer the same questions repeatedly with the affect of someone hearing them for the first time. One interviewer, following the established script, asked her how she felt about the public perception that she dated frequently and wrote songs about ex-boyfriends. She paused, not the long, uncertain pause of someone caught off guard, but the brief, deliberate pause of someone choosing their words with surgical care. Then she said, "I find it interesting that when I write about my experiences, it becomes a character flaw, but when I keep quiet about my experiences, I'm being dishonest with my fans. There's no version that's acceptable." Then she smiled and moved to the next question. The interviewer did not follow up. The exchange did not make headlines. It should have. What she was describing in that moment was not merely a personal grievance, but a structural problem with the way culture processes female artistic agency, the double bind in which self-expression becomes evidence of disorder and silence becomes evidence of inauthenticity. She had identified it precisely, named it with clarity, and then set it aside and continued working. This was, in its way, the most revealing thing about her. The analysis was always there. The grievance was always earned. But she did not let either one become the thing that stopped the pen from moving. The media caricature of 2012 and 2013 did not destroy her. It did not even significantly slow her. But it did something subtler and in the long run more significant. It taught her in the most public and unforgiving classroom imaginable exactly how much the world's interpretation of her story was going to diverge from her own. This was a lesson that other artists had learned later, or more slowly, or at greater cost. She learned it at 22, in the back of a SUV, with a legal pad and a pen that kept moving. The songs she was writing during those years were not, in the end, about the men. They were about the experience of being a young woman in full possession of her own narrative, and watching the world refuse to accept the deed. All Too Well was not a song about a lost relationship. It was a song about the persistence of perception against the erosion of time, about the way a scarf left at a sister's apartment becomes a symbol of all the things that get taken and not returned. The emotional precision of that song, the specificity of its imagery, the way it builds not toward a chorus, but toward a kind of reckoning, placed it in a different category from almost anything being produced in popular music at that moment. It was the song of someone who had decided that if the world was going to read her diary, she would make sure the diary was worth reading. By the end of 2013, as the promotional cycle for Red wound down and the industry began speculating about what came next, the answer was already taking shape in the same methodical, forward-looking way that had characterized every transition of her career. She had spent 2 years being defined by others. She had watched the caricature acquire its own momentum, its own comedy special, its own Wikipedia section. She had smiled at the Golden Globes and answered the questions and kept the legal pad moving. Now she was watching the horizon with the particular focus of someone who has identified not just what the problem is, but what the solution looks like, and who understands that the solution, when it arrives, will need to be loud enough to drown out every joke that came before it. The next album would not meet the world where it was. It would move the world to an entirely different location, and it would do so with such deliberate, architecturally precise force that the people who had spent 2 years reducing her to a punchline would find themselves, almost without understanding how it happened, living inside the world she had built. But first, the caricature would have to be confronted directly. And she was already writing The Confrontation. Chapter 36. The Red Tour, Stadium Trials and Visual Redesign. The lights go out in Ford Field, and 60,000 people stop breathing. It is March 2014, but the seeds were planted a year earlier when Taylor Swift stood in rehearsal space in Nashville and stared at a set design that looked nothing like anything she had ever done before. Gone were the fairy lights. Gone were the pastoral banners and the storybook archways that had defined the Speak Now World Tour, that gilded theatrical world she had constructed like a novelist building a set. What replaced them was stark and deliberate: black scaffolding, industrial steel, white light cutting through manufactured fog like something between a rock concert and a fever dream. She walked the length of the stage and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said more. That single word, not a question, not an instruction, but a declaration, tells you something essential about who Taylor Swift was becoming in the years between 2010 and 2013. She had spent the better part of a decade being the girl with the guitar and the notebook, the one who wrote your heartbreak back to you in rhyming couplets and made you feel seen in the specific way that only great songwriters can. She had been platinum and Grammy-crowned, and the subject of magazine covers and think pieces, and the occasional backhanded compliment dressed as praise. But Red, the album that arrived in October 2012 like a weather system nobody had quite predicted, announced something more complicated. It announced an artist in the process of outgrowing the container she had built for herself. The Red Tour, formally launched in March 2013 and extending through a second North American leg in 2014, was the physical manifestation of that outgrowth, the live spectacle through which Swift attempted to translate an album of tonal contradictions into a coherent, electrifying theatrical experience. And it would prove to be one of the most revealing gauntlets of her career. In the early years of the 2010s, the cultural landscape of American popular music was undergoing a seismic reorganization. The streaming era had not yet fully arrived. Spotify had only launched in the United States in 2011, but digital consumption was already fracturing the album as a unified artistic object. Singles dominated. Attention spans contracted. The music industry, which had spent the first decade of the millennium lurching through the aftermath of Napster and iTunes, was now scrambling to understand what a sustainable pop career even looked like in an environment where any song could be detached from its context and consumed in isolation on a smartphone. The artists who thrived in this climate were often those who could generate a kind of omnipresence, who could be everywhere at once, who could collapse genre distinctions and capture listeners across multiple demographic tributaries simultaneously. Swift had watched this shift with the particular attentiveness of someone who understood instinctively that the next decade would belong to those who could read the room before the room knew what it wanted. She had also watched, more specifically, what happened to artists who clung too tightly to the identity that had made them famous. The country establishment that had both embraced and quietly condescended to her, never quite sure whether to celebrate her as their own or dismiss her as a crossover novelty, was not going to hold her forever. She was 22 when Red was released, 23 when the tour began. She was making decisions that would determine the trajectory of the next decade. The core conflict of the Red Tour era was not primarily logistical, though the logistics were genuinely formidable. This was Swift's first sustained engagement with arena and stadium venues, at a scale that dwarfed her previous touring footprint. The Speak Now World Tour had been large, but Red pushed further, booking amphitheaters and football stadiums and hockey arenas in markets she had not previously attempted at this volume. The production requirements alone, the automation, the pyrotechnics, the screens, the costume changes that numbered in the double digits per night, constituted a kind of industrial undertaking that had very little precedent in the careers of artists her age. Managing a production of that complexity, while also delivering a performance that felt intimate enough to maintain the parasocial bond that was the foundational architecture of her fandom, required a kind of split consciousness that most performers never develop. But the deeper conflict was aesthetic and strategic. Red the album was a deliberately hybrid object. It contained country-inflected ballads and pure pop confections and folk-influenced mid-tempos and one 8-minute epic that defied easy categorization. It had been co-written with collaborators, including Max Martin and Shellback, the Swedish production team, whose fingerprints were on some of the most commercially dominant pop records of the previous decade. Their collaboration on We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together had produced Swift's first number, one single on the Billboard Hot 100, and the song's breezy, genre-agnostic confidence signaled clearly which direction the wind was blowing. But translating that hybridity into a live show meant committing, visually and atmospherically, to something that could hold all of those tonal registers at once without feeling schizophrenic. The decision to pursue the black and white aesthetic was not made casually. Swift and her creative director, the designer Ethan Silverman, along with her longtime lighting collaborators, spent months working through the visual language of the tour. The color red itself presented a paradox. The album's title and emotional register were saturated with it, drenched in the warmth and violence of that particular hue. But deploying red literally on a stadium stage risked the kind of literal-minded stagecraft that Swift had always instinctively avoided. Instead, the team landed on a counterintuitive solution. If Red the album was about emotional extremity, about feeling things so intensely that color itself became insufficient to contain them, then the live show would strip color away almost entirely, would present the music in the starkest possible visual language, and would let the emotional content burn through the monochrome like a fire through paper. The result was a stage that looked like nothing in contemporary country or pop touring. The main structure was a massive black proscenium, flanked by industrial lighting rigs. The screens displayed high-contrast imagery that recalled fashion photography as much as concert visuals. Swift herself cycled through costumes that emphasized a sharper, more angular silhouette than the flowing dresses and cowboy boots of her earlier stages. Sequined bodysuits, tailored blazers, knee-high boots that read as fashion-forward in a way that deliberately signaled a downtown aesthetic her previous touring persona had never attempted. The creative logic was transparent but not cynical. She was telling her audience, show by show, city by city, that the girl who had stood on a stage in Nashville at 17 strumming a guitar about Romeo and Juliet still existed inside this new configuration, but that she was no longer the whole story. The rehearsal period produced one anecdote that her production team would recount for years afterward. During a technical run-through of the show's opening sequence, a carefully choreographed descent from a high platform above the stage, set to the opening bars of a medley, Swift noticed that the lighting cue was hitting approximately 2 seconds late relative to the musical downbeat. The delay was small enough that most audience members would never register it consciously. It was not, by any conventional standard, a problem worth stopping a full production rehearsal to address. She stopped the rehearsal. She walked to the lighting board. She sat with the lighting director for 45 minutes until the cue was adjusted to her satisfaction. When asked afterward why a 2-second discrepancy warranted that level of intervention, she offered an answer that revealed her understanding of live performance as a cumulative perceptual experience. She said that the audience didn't know what they were going to feel when they watched that moment, and that their feeling depended on 1,000 micro-decisions they would never consciously register. 2 seconds, she said, was 2 seconds too many between what the music promised and what the eyes received. This was not perfectionism for its own sake. It was the conviction, refined through a decade of live performance, that the emotional contract between a performer and an audience is extraordinarily fragile, and that its maintenance requires a level of attention that most performers are not temperamentally equipped to sustain 8 times a week across multiple continents. The relationship that crystallized most revealingly during the Red Tour era was Swift's creative partnership with Max Martin and Shellback, specifically the Swede known as Shellback, whose real name was Carl Johan Schuster, and whose instincts about sonic texture and melodic construction would prove to be among the most influential forces on the next chapter of Swift's career. Their collaboration on Red had been Swift's most deliberate engagement with the architecture of mainstream pop production, and the results had exposed her to a compositional vocabulary that her earlier work, rooted as it was in Nashville's songcraft traditions, had never quite accessed. Martin and Shellback wrote and produced music that operated according to different principles. The hook arrived faster, the dynamic shifts were engineered rather than intuited. The relationship between a lyric and its sonic environment was calculated with a precision that had nothing to do with folk song spontaneity and everything to do with the science of attention. What was interesting about Swift in this relationship was that she never became a passenger. Collaborators who worked with her during this period consistently described a process in which she arrived at sessions with developed melodic and lyrical concepts, in which she pushed back on production choices that conflicted with her instincts, and in which the final product reflected a genuine synthesis rather than a takeover. The industry had a long history of young female artists being absorbed by powerful male producers, shaped, rebranded, repackaged in ways that prioritized commercial utility over artistic continuity. Swift's engagement with the pop production world subverted that history, not through confrontation, but through a kind of strategic selectivity that kept her creative center of gravity exactly where she had always maintained it, with herself. By the time the Red Tour reached its stadium nights, the outdoor shows in markets like Chicago, Foxborough, and Los Angeles that represented her largest-scale performances to that point, something had crystallized. The audience that showed up for those nights was not a country audience or a pop audience or a teen demographic or a generational cohort. It was all of those things simultaneously, and the fact that they had all come to the same place to watch the same show meant that Swift had managed something genuinely rare. She had expanded her reach without diluting her specificity. The fans who had followed her from the Fearless years were still there. So were listeners who had found her through We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together on the radio. The show held them both because it was honest about the complexity it was trying to contain. The stadium itself was a new kind of pressure. The scale of an outdoor football stadium is not simply a quantitative amplification of an arena. It is a qualitatively different relationship between a performer and an audience, one in which the back rows are so far from the stage that the entire concept of connection requires reimagining. Swift had watched how the previous generation of stadium-scale artists, U2, Beyoncé, Bruce Springsteen, had solved this problem through the strategic deployment of video screens, through the creation of moments so large that scale itself became the emotional payload. She borrowed from that tradition while maintaining her core instinct about intimacy, which was to make each song feel like it was being performed for a single person, even when 60,000 people were watching. She didn't entirely solve the problem on the Red Tour. There were nights when the stadium's physical enormity swallowed the more delicate moments, the acoustic segments, the intimate confessional bridges that worked so well in smaller rooms, and where the production, for all its sophistication, felt like it was compensating rather than transcending. These were not failures exactly. They were the productive friction of a performer testing the outermost limits of what she could do, and filing the results away for future reference. But what the Red Tour established, beyond any individual performance, was that Taylor Swift could operate at this scale without losing the essential quality that had made her famous in the first place. She could fill a stadium and still make you feel somehow that she was talking to you specifically. That was a rare capacity, and she knew she had it. What she did not yet know, what she was only beginning to sense in the blue cold of those stadium nights, with the lights dimming and the crowd noise rising and the new aesthetic snapping into place around her, was that the collaborations she had begun with the architects of contemporary pop production were not a chapter she was writing but a door she was opening, and that on the other side of that door, in the not quite visible distance, an entirely new version of herself was already waiting, already impatient, already prepared to demand something far more radical than more. Chapter 37. Navigating the Nashville to Pop Divide. The studio smells like cedar and cold coffee, and Taylor Swift is standing very still. It is sometime in the early months of 2012, and the room around her is alive with the low hum of equipment, the soft ticking of a clock above the mixing board, the distant Nashville traffic bleeding through insulated walls. She has been here before, in rooms like this, in rooms exactly like this, since she was 14 years old, since the days when she dragged a rolling suitcase up and down Music Row and knocked on doors that only sometimes opened. But something in the air tonight is different. She holds a legal pad against her chest, covered in handwriting that loops and crosses over itself, verses and bridges and fragments that do not yet sound like anything Nashville would recognize. She stares at the board. She stares at the engineer. She does not say what she is thinking, which is that she has already decided. She decided weeks ago. Perhaps she decided years ago, in the back of a tour bus, in the margins of a journal, the first time she heard a synthesizer cut through a pop radio station like light through a slat in a curtain. She only had to find the nerve to say it out loud. That nerve, and what it cost her, is the story of this chapter. By the close of 2010, Taylor Swift occupied a position in American popular music that would have seemed improbable to anyone who had met her as a teenager in Hendersonville, Tennessee, scribbling chord progressions into the back of a school notebook. Her third album, Speak Now, released in October of that year, had sold over 1 million copies in its first week, a figure that placed her in a very small company of artists who had achieved that threshold in the digital age, when album sales had become more eulogy than metric for the music industry as a whole. She had won the Grammy for Album of the Year at 20. She had filled arenas in Australia and the United Kingdom. She had become, by nearly every quantifiable measure, the most commercially successful country artist of her generation. And yet, country music as an institution had always held something back from her. Not the fans. The fans were unambiguous and vast and demonstrably devoted. But the institution itself, that deeply rooted infrastructure of radio programmers and label executives and the invisible architecture of Nashville consensus, watched her with a particular kind of ambivalence. She was too pop for the purists and too country for the mainstream tastemakers, a position that could feel like the best of both worlds or like belonging fully to neither. The Country Music Association had embraced her, had draped awards around her shoulders, and put her on its stages. But there was always a murmur underneath the applause, a persistent critical refrain that questioned whether her voice was strong enough, her roots deep enough, her commitment to the form sufficiently orthodox. In 2010, a widely discussed assessment in a prominent music publication suggested that her live vocal performances revealed technical limitations that her studio recordings carefully obscured. The conversation was not new, but it had grown louder in proportion to her success, as if the scale of her popularity itself invited a kind of institutional suspicion. The world beyond Nashville was transforming at a pace that made the country music establishment look, to certain eyes, like a beautiful and elaborately preserved ruin. Streaming had not yet dismantled the album economy entirely, but it was already rewriting the grammar of how audiences consumed music. Shorter attention spans, genre agnosticism, an appetite for the immediate and the visceral that seemed at odds with the patient storytelling architecture of classic country. The cultural center of gravity in popular music had shifted decisively toward the transatlantic pop production model. Max Martin in Stockholm, building hooks that functioned like precision instruments, producers in London and Los Angeles layering electronic textures over melodic structures of almost mathematical efficiency. Adele's 21 had spent weeks at the top of every chart in the English-speaking world. Katy Perry was inescapable. The radio landscape in 2012 was a place where country roots were not so much unwelcome as simply irrelevant, a distinction that matters enormously to an artist trying to decide who she wants to become. Swift was trying to decide exactly that. The core conflict she faced during this period was not, as it was sometimes characterized in the press, a simple choice between two genres, as if she were standing at a literal fork in a road with a sign pointing toward Nashville on one side and New York on the other. The conflict was subtler and more psychologically demanding than that. It was the conflict between an identity she had built with genuine care and devotion. The girl from Pennsylvania who moved to Tennessee at 14, who had learned to play guitar on a front porch, who had co-written every song on every album she had ever released, who had staked her credibility on authenticity in a genre where authenticity is the primary currency, and an ambition that had quietly outgrown the container the genre provided. She was not abandoning country music. She was discovering, with the particular discomfort of someone who is constitutionally honest with herself, that country music could no longer fully contain what she wanted to say or how she wanted to say it. This is a distinction that Nashville did not always appreciate. The decision to reach beyond the traditional boundaries of her genre came into sharpest focus during the creation of Red, the album she would spend the better part of 2012 assembling with an unusually wide circle of collaborators. For the first time in her career, she worked extensively with producers who had no particular investment in the conventions of country music, most significantly, in the sessions that would produce the album's most sonically adventurous moments, with Max Martin and his collaborator Shellback, the Swedish production team, whose fingerprints were on some of the most architecturally precise pop music of the preceding decade. The sessions that produced what would become We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together were, by multiple accounts, remarkably swift. The song assembled in something close to a single afternoon, a melodic argument conducted at the speed of instinct. When Swift heard the result, she reportedly laughed. Not because it was funny exactly, but because it was so obviously, undeniably right in a way that surprised even her. That laughter is the keyhole. There is a version of Taylor Swift, who, at this particular juncture, could have made the safer choice. Who could have looked at what she had already built? The devoted country fanbase, the institutional goodwill of Nashville, the awards and the ticket sales, and the carefully cultivated image of a girl with a guitar and a diary, and decided that the risk of alienating any part of that foundation was too great. The industry was full of artists who had attempted the genre crossover and found themselves stranded between constituencies, claimed by neither. Country radio could be unforgiving toward artists perceived as defectors. And Swift, whatever else she was a person who understood the economics and the politics of the music business with a clarity unusual in someone her age. She had been paying attention since before she was old enough to drive. She did not make the safer choice. The laughter in that studio was the laughter of someone who had been carrying a question for a long time and had just heard the answer. And the answer was bigger and stranger than expected, and the only appropriate response was a kind of incredulous delight. She did not soften, "We are never ever getting back together," for country radio. She did not add a steel guitar. She released it as it was, bright and synth-driven and structurally a pop song in every meaningful sense of the term, and it became the fastest-selling digital single in the history of the iTunes Store at that point, a fact that settled certain arguments with the clean finality of a closing door. The relationship that anchored and complicated this period more than any other was the one she maintained with Scott Borchetta, the founder of Big Machine Records, the independent Nashville label that had signed her at 15 and built its own commercial fortunes substantially on the foundation of hers. Borchetta was, by any fair assessment, one of the architects of her success, a man who had believed in her before the industry's consensus caught up to that belief, who had given her creative latitude that a major label might not have extended to an untested teenager. The bond between them was genuine and was grounded in a shared history of improbable vindication. But as Red took shape and its pop ambitions became more evident, the question of how far that latitude extended began to assert itself quietly in their relationship. Borchetta was not opposed to the crossover in principle. Big Machine had benefited enormously from Swift's pop crossover radio success, and he understood, perhaps better than the Nashville establishment at large, that her audience was not reducible to a country audience. But the label existed within the Nashville ecosystem, had relationships and dependencies within that ecosystem, and there were limits, institutional, financial, relational, to how aggressively it could afford to pivot. The conversations between them during this period had the texture of two people who trusted each other navigating a question that trust alone could not resolve, because the question was ultimately about the future, and the future they were each imagining was not quite the same future. Swift's response, characteristic of a certain quality in her that the people closest to her describe as a kind of quiet implacability, was to move forward and let the results make the argument for her. She retained her country identity publicly, continued to present herself within the Nashville framework, continued to acknowledge the genre that had formed her with evident and unperformed sincerity. She was not reinventing herself. She was expanding, and she was doing it on her own terms, on her own timeline, without asking permission from an institution that had not, in the end, granted her unconditional membership in the first place. Red, released in October 2012, was the document of a mind in productive crisis. It did not resolve the tension between her country identity and her pop ambitions. It staged that tension deliberately, placed a song like Begin Again, with its acoustic gentleness and its careful country craftsmanship, alongside the gleaming electronic architecture of I Knew You Were Trouble, and asked the listener to hold both as authentic expressions of the same sensibility. Critics were divided in the way critics often are when they encounter something that does not fit neatly into the categories they have prepared. Some heard incoherence. Others heard the first real evidence of an artist whose range was larger than the genre she had started in could accommodate. The public, as was becoming habitual, was largely uninterested in the critical debate and simply responded to the music with the kind of sustained enthusiasm that translates into 9 million copies sold worldwide. Nashville watched all of this with a mixture of pride and unease that it did not always express elegantly. Swift was still, technically, a country artist. She still attended the CMA Awards. She still cited Dolly Parton and Shania Twain in interviews when asked about her influences. And she cited them without apparent calculation, which is to say she cited them because they were actually her influences. But the center of gravity in her career had shifted, and the Nashville establishment could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the sky shows any evidence, something in the air pressure, something in the quality of light, a subtle reorganization of the atmosphere that precedes the storm proper. The storm proper was still a few years away. For now, there was the album, and the world tour that would follow, and the particular sensation of standing at the edge of something enormous and not yet knowing whether the ground on the other side would hold. What no one in Nashville fully reckoned with, in the autumn of 2012, was that the genre she would eventually leave behind was not the only thing she was preparing to outgrow, that the label relationship, the institutional affiliations, the very infrastructure of her professional life were quietly accumulating the weight of a future renegotiation, one whose terms would prove far more consequential than anyone then imagined, and whose resolution would ultimately redefine not just her career, but the terms on which artists in the streaming age could claim ownership of their own history. Chapter 38. The Big Machine Tension, Master Ownership Realities. The studio is cold in the particular way that only recording studios can be. A chill that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with fluorescent light and the hum of machinery waiting to be told what to do. Taylor Swift sits behind the glass in late 2011, headphones around her neck rather than over her ears, and she is listening. Not to the track playing back through the monitors, though that is playing too. A skeletal arrangement, acoustic guitar and a ghost of a melody, but to something else entirely. To the silence beneath the sound. To the question that has been living in the back of her throat for months now, growing teeth. She is 21 years old, and she already knows something that most artists her age do not: the difference between making music and owning it. The country music world that had made Taylor Swift a phenomenon by the time she turned 19 was, in 2010 and 2011, beginning to feel like a costume she had outgrown rather than a skin she had grown into. The Speak Now era had proven her capabilities as a pure songwriter. Every track written alone, a deliberate rebuttal to critics who had suggested she needed a committee to produce her work, but even that triumph carried within it a subtle unease. She had written every word. She had conceived every melody. And yet the recordings themselves, those specific performances captured on tape and transferred to masters, belonged not to her, but to the Nashville label that had signed a teenager from Hendersonville, Pennsylvania, before the music industry had any meaningful framework for understanding what she might become. The cultural moment of 2010 to 2013 was one defined by an accelerating rupture between the old architecture of the music business and the emerging digital landscape reshaping it from the floor up. iTunes had already fractured the album economy. Streaming services were beginning their slow, inexorable rise, Spotify launching in the United States in 2011, promising a future in which music existed not as object but as access. For legacy artists and major labels, the implications were uncomfortable. For a young artist with Swift's commercial weight and her particular awareness of long-term value, the implications were something else entirely. They were a map of everything she stood to lose if she did not move decisively while she still had leverage. Big Machine Records had been, in the beginning, something close to a family. Scott Borchetta had signed her in 2006 when she was 14, when the conventional wisdom in Nashville held that a teenage girl who insisted on writing her own material was a charming hobby rather than a serious commercial proposition. He had been proven spectacularly wrong, and the label had been built substantially on the foundation of her success. By the time Red was taking shape in 2012, Taylor Swift was not merely Big Machine's flagship artist. She was, in a meaningful financial sense, the roof, the walls, and the foundation. This interdependence was, on its surface, a position of strength. In practice, it was more complicated. Contract negotiations in the music industry rarely proceed according to the logic of fairness. They proceed according to the logic of leverage, and leverage shifts like weather. Swift's team had begun preliminary conversations about what a future relationship with Big Machine might look like, and the question of master recordings, who would own the canonical recordings of her catalog, had surfaced early and refused to submerge. The industry standard of the era was not on her side. Artists signed young, before they had accumulated the commercial history to negotiate from strength, almost universally surrendered ownership of their masters to their labels. The label financed the recording, the argument went, and therefore the label owned the result. It was a logic that had structured the music business for decades, producing an entire generation of artists who discovered, sometimes decades into their careers, that the recordings most intimately associated with their identity could be licensed, sold, or otherwise deployed without their consent or meaningful compensation. Prince had raged against this architecture so completely that he had written the word slave on his face and changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol. Don Henley had spent years in congressional testimony attempting to reform the copyright frameworks that enabled it. The system had, for the most part, absorbed all of this resistance and continued unchanged. Taylor Swift was paying attention. This was, in many ways, her defining characteristic, not the songwriting talent, which was real but not unique in kind, nor the vocal ability, which was genuine but not exceptional by the operatic standards the industry sometimes applied to female artists, but the attention. The granular, meticulous, almost jurisprudential attention she brought to the business of her own career. She had read contracts as a teenager, when other teenagers were reading gossip blogs. She asked questions in rooms where young artists were typically expected to be grateful and quiet. She understood, with a clarity that made some of the men in those rooms visibly uncomfortable, that gratitude and business acumen were not mutually exclusive. The core tension she faced was not simply contractual. It was existential, in the way that only matters of creative identity can be existential. If the masters belonged to Big Machine, then in some fundamental sense, Taylor Swift, the recorded Taylor Swift, the Taylor Swift that the world could actually hear, belonged to Big Machine. Every performance, every vocal take, every carefully constructed sonic moment from Tim McGraw to Love Story to Mean, existed in a legal framework where her ownership was not a given. She could write the songs. She could perform them. She could not, without label permission, exercise ultimate control over how those recordings lived in the world, who could use them, what they could be attached to, how they might be sold or packaged or transferred if the label itself were ever to change hands. She raised this. She raised it specifically, in the direct way that she had learned was the only effective way to raise things in rooms full of people whose financial interests were structurally opposed to her own. Borchetta's position, as it would be characterized in subsequent years, was that masters were simply not how the deal worked. That big machine, like every other label, retained ownership of recordings as a condition of the investment it made in producing them. There were conversations. There was, by most accounts, a genuine attempt on both sides to find language that acknowledged the complexity of their interdependence. But the fundamental architecture did not change. The masters would remain with the label. What Swift did with that information is perhaps the most revealing thing about her character in this period. She did not storm out. She did not go public. She did not, at least not yet, make the dispute into a story. Instead, she did something quieter and, in retrospect, more consequential. She began, in parallel with continuing to work within the existing framework, to build toward a future in which the framework might be different. She was thinking in decades, not quarters, and she was doing it at 22 with the patience of someone 3 times that age. The recording of Red, which began in earnest in 2012, was itself an act of strategic expansion that must be read partly in this context. The album's producers read like a manifesto. Nathan Chapman, her longtime Nashville collaborator, yes, but also Max Martin and Shellback, the Swedish pop architects behind some of the most commercially dominant recordings of the preceding decade, and Jeff Bhaskar, whose fingerprints were on contemporary pop and hip-hop productions that bore no relationship whatsoever to the country radio format that had made her famous. This was not genre confusion. It was deliberate border crossing, a calibrated move toward a sonic terrain that was larger, louder, and less geographically bounded than country Nashville. A move, whether consciously framed this way or not, toward the kind of mainstream ubiquity that would eventually give her negotiating leverage no country artist, however successful, could fully command. Max Martin, who had been shaping pop radio since the late 90s with a precision that was more engineering than artistry, represented something specific for Swift in this moment. He understood the mechanics of enormity, how a song could be constructed to feel simultaneously intimate and stadium-sized, how a chorus could be designed to function as a moment of communal release. In their early collaborations, which would yield We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together, and begin a creative conversation that would deepen significantly in the years ahead, Swift demonstrated something that surprised even collaborators who had worked with the biggest names in the industry. She was not passive. She did not arrive to sessions as a performer waiting to be produced. She arrived with opinions, with structural instincts, with a willingness to push back on arrangements that did not serve the emotional logic of the song as she understood it. This was, in the context of the industry she was navigating, quietly radical. Female artists in pop music, even at her commercial level, were frequently managed into passive roles within production relationships, their voices used, their images deployed, their opinions tolerated within limits set by the men controlling the boards. Swift had grown up in a label ecosystem that had, to its credit, allowed her more creative latitude than most. But she understood that creative latitude, extended informally, by the goodwill of specific people, was categorically different from creative authority grounded in ownership. One could be withdrawn. The other could not. The treacherous sessions, and the recording of All Too Well, which would extend to 10 minutes in its unexpurgated form, a sprawling, unflinching emotional excavation that the album version would ultimately truncate to half its length, illuminated something essential about where she was as an artist. The longer version existed. She had written it and recorded it. And she had chosen, for now, to set it aside. There was something almost architectural in that decision, a sense of a person who was building something larger than the current moment, who was willing to defer certain expressions of her full range until the conditions for receiving them were right. The relationship with Nathan Chapman, her primary producer since her debut, carried within it in this period a particular poignancy. Chapman had been with her from the beginning, had shaped the specific sonic world of her early country recordings, and his collaboration on Red was genuine and important. But the album's structure announced, unmistakably, that she was expanding beyond what any single collaborator could provide. This was not rupture, it was evolution. Chapman was present. He simply was not alone anymore. And in that shift, in the careful, respectful way she moved toward a larger sonic palette without discarding the person who had helped her build the first one, something of her essential character was visible. She was loyal up to the precise point where loyalty would require her to be smaller than she intended to become. By the time Red was released in October 2012, to commercial reception that validated every instinct that had driven its creation, selling over 1 million copies in its first week in the United States, a number that no album by any artist had achieved in nearly a decade, the contract conversations with Big Machine had not been resolved. They had been, in the particular Nashville way, deferred. There was still time on her existing deal. The question of what came next remained open. And Swift, who understood that open questions were not neutral, that time and circumstance were always tilting the answer one direction or another, was watching the clock with the attention of someone who had already decided that the next negotiation would be different, even if she could not yet say precisely how. The storm she was building toward was not the kind that announces itself with thunder. It was the kind that arrives on a clear day, dressed in commerce and contract language, only revealing its full dimensions once it has already begun to change the landscape in ways that cannot be undone. What she did not know, what no one in those rooms fully understood yet, was that the resolution of this particular question would not come from any negotiation at the Big Machine table. It would come from somewhere else entirely, from a sequence of events that would begin with a sale and end with a war conducted in public, in ways the music industry had never seen before and has not entirely recovered from since. Chapter 39. The first streaming platform withdrawal. The studio smells like cold coffee and ambition. It is late in Nashville, sometime past midnight in the autumn of 2010, and Taylor Swift sits hunched over a mixing board at Blackbird Studio, her long fingers tracing the edge of a lyric sheet that has been revised so many times the paper has gone soft at the folds. Around her, the room hums with the low electricity of people trying to make something that matters. Producer Nathan Chapman leans back in his chair, listening to a playback that sounds, even in its rough form, like something different. Something larger. Taylor lifts her head. She does not say anything for a long moment. She just listens. That silence is not uncertainty. It is calculation. She has spent the last 4 years building a world from scratch, a world of small towns, pickup trucks, bleacher stands, and the particular ache of being 15 and misunderstood. That world had made her a millionaire before she could legally drink. It had given her 5 Grammy Awards and a fearless album that sold more copies than any country record in nearly a decade. And now, at 20 years old, standing on the threshold of something she cannot yet name, she is preparing to dismantle it. The early years of the 2010s arrive with a strange duality pressing down on American culture. The country is still pulling itself from the wreckage of a financial crisis, and with it comes a generation of young people who have never known a world without the internet, never held a CD as a rite of passage, never waited for Friday to hear a new album. Music is changing beneath everyone's feet, dissolving from a physical object into something ambient and invisible, something streamed from servers in data centers to earbuds on subway cars. Spotify had launched in the United States in 2011. Pandora was already reshaping how listeners discovered sound. The economics of recorded music, an industry still reeling from the peer-to-peer piracy wars of the mid-2000s, were being reorganized again, faster and with less mercy than before. For most artists, streaming felt like a gift. For Taylor Swift and her manager Scott Borchetta, it felt like a trap dressed in the clothes of progress. The numbers told a devastating story if you bothered to read them carefully, which Taylor did. Streaming platforms were paying fractions of a cent per listen. An artist needed millions of streams, not thousands, millions, to generate what a single week of traditional album sales might yield for a mid-level act. For superstars at the top of the market, the arithmetic was merely insulting. For the middle tier, the thousands of musicians who existed just beyond the margin of celebrity, streaming risked becoming a slow financial suffocation dressed up as democratization. Taylor sat with these numbers. She turned them over the way she turned over a half-finished lyric, looking for what they meant beneath what they said. The core of her conflict during this period is not, as it would later be caricatured, about money. It is about something older and more complicated, the belief that creative labor carries inherent worth, and that a system which renders that labor effectively free is not a distribution model, but an act of erasure dressed in the language of access. She had watched the music industry collapse around Napster and LimeWire. She had seen her earliest heroes quietly vanish from the charts, not because their talent had diminished, but because the financial scaffolding that once supported the long careers of working musicians had been knocked out from under them. She was not naive about the economics of her own position. She understood that she could survive streaming in a way that most of her contemporaries could not. That, paradoxically, was precisely what gave her the standing to object on behalf of those who could not afford to. What made the streaming question so operationally thorny was its collision with the larger project underway, Red. The album that would become Taylor's fourth studio release was unlike anything she had attempted. In earlier sessions, she had worked almost exclusively within the gravity of Nashville, within the idiom of country music, within the warm acoustic embrace of genres that still cared about where you were from. Red broke that orbit. She had begun co-writing with Max Martin and Shellback, the Swedish production duo responsible for engineering some of the most precise, aerodynamic pop music of the preceding decade, the kind of sound that felt simultaneously inescapable and inevitable. She sat across from them in Stockholm studios that felt nothing like Blackbird, rooms flooded with northern light, with a different architecture of silence, and she wrote songs that refused to fit neatly into any single category. "We Are Never Getting Back Together" was the opening salvo, fizzing, percussive, almost confrontational in its brightness. "I Knew You Were Trouble" bent toward electronic dance music with a drop that would have been unthinkable on Fearless. 22 was pure pop ecstasy without apology. And threading through it all, connecting the brash commercial experiments to something raw and more urgent, were tracks like All Too Well, a 5-minute excavation of romantic grief that many of her collaborators would later describe as one of the most accomplished pieces of writing she had ever produced. A song so complete and so devastating that there was briefly serious discussion about whether its length made it commercially viable as a single. She kept it at full length on the album. That decision alone is a window into how she was thinking. The tension between artistic integrity and commercial architecture was not abstract for Taylor during the Red era. It was the central negotiation of her creative life, conducted daily across 2 hemispheres, in studios and on tour buses and in the margins of lyric notebooks. She was trying to do something that the music industry tends to punish: expand without abandoning. She wanted her country audience to follow her toward pop without feeling betrayed. She wanted pop audiences to recognize her without thinking she had been assembled by a committee. The space between those two ambitions is narrow and littered with the careers of people who tried to navigate it and miscalculated. What Red revealed, more than any previous record, was Taylor's fundamental nature as a maximalist. Not maximalism in the sense of chaos or excess, but in the sense of someone who believes that more can be truer, that the right detail, the right instrument layered beneath the right lyric at the right moment, adds a dimension of feeling rather than merely adding sound. The album runs long. It refuses to choose a lane. It contains country, pop, rock, and folk without committing fully to any of them. And the critics who received it in October 2012 did not quite know what to do with it. Some called it brilliant and scattered. Some called it a commercial calculation dressed as artistic evolution. Some simply called it too much. It sold over 2 million copies in its first week. Scott Borchetta had been the architect of much of the business infrastructure that made Taylor's career possible. He had founded Big Machine Records in 2005, partly on the conviction that Taylor Swift was a generational talent who deserved a generational platform, and he had spent 7 years building that platform brick by brick. His relationship with Taylor during the Red period was one of genuine strategic partnership, two people who understood each other's instincts well enough to argue productively. Borchetta had navigated the country establishment, the Grammy politics, the radio politics, and the merciless arithmetic of album cycles with a competence that was easy to overlook because it was so rarely visible from the outside. It was Borchetta who helped Taylor frame the streaming question not merely as a philosophical grievance, but as a policy position, something with teeth, something that could generate real pressure on platforms that had grown accustomed to getting what they wanted from artists too economically vulnerable to refuse. The decision to withdraw her catalog from Spotify, which arrived in November 2014, though its roots stretched back through the entire Red era, did not happen in a single dramatic meeting. It accumulated over years of careful analysis and deliberate moral reasoning. Taylor later explained her position with the directness that characterized her best public statements. Music is art, and art has inherent value, and value should not be treated as though it is optional. The Spotify withdrawal made news as a business story. It became something more than that. At a moment when most artists, even major ones, were signing whatever terms the platforms offered because refusal felt like commercial suicide, Taylor's decision functioned as a signal. It said that the negotiation was not over. It said that the artist's side of the table had not been entirely abandoned. It did not change the economics of streaming overnight, but it introduced a friction into conversations that had previously moved in one direction only. There is a specific moment from the Red promotional period, recounted in various forms by people who were present, that illuminates the quality of attention Taylor brought to these questions. During a radio interview, she was asked about piracy and streaming in terms that expected a diplomatic non-answer, the kind of careful corporate hedging that publicists train artists to deliver. She did not deliver it. She said, in essence, that she simply believed people who create things for a living deserve to be paid for those things, and that she did not understand why that idea had become controversial. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone says plainly what everyone has been dancing around. That plainness, the refusal to dress a moral position in the softening language of strategy, is one of the defining characteristics of how Taylor has operated throughout her public life. It generates affection and antagonism in roughly equal measure, often from the same people, depending on the subject. During the Red era, it was beginning to define her as something more than a songwriter or a pop star. It was defining her as a participant in the industry's reckoning with itself. The world she moved through in these years was also a world in active cultural negotiation. The early 2010s were a period of intense, sometimes painful conversation about who got to speak, who got to be heard, and what the responsibilities of public figures were toward the communities that had elevated them. Taylor existed at a peculiar intersection of those conversations, enormously famous, enormously young, enormously female, in an industry and a media culture that had very specific and often contradictory ideas about what all three of those things meant together. She was celebrated for her relatability, and simultaneously scrutinized for her relationships in ways that male artists of equivalent stature were not. She was praised for her songwriting, and simultaneously condescended to about her songwriting in the same breath. The criticism often arrived wearing the clothes of concern. She absorbed it, She transmuted it. She put it in the songs. I go on too many dates, she wrote in Shake It Off, a track that would not arrive until 1989, but whose spirit was already visible in the architecture of Red, the decision to take the relentless public commentary on her personal life and refuse it the dignity of a defensive response. She would not explain herself. She would not apologize. She would write the joke at her own expense before anyone else could, and in doing so she would control the frame entirely. That is not passivity. That is a sophisticated form of creative judo. The Red era concludes without conclusion. That is its nature. Taylor finishes the album cycle, the arena tour, the critical discourse about genre and identity and commercial ambition, and she does not arrive anywhere stable. She arrives somewhere new, which is not the same thing. The streaming withdrawal that plays out formally in the months after Red has already been decided in principle during the making of it, decided the way the most important decisions are usually made, not in a single room on a single night, but in the slow accumulation of small reckonings and quiet convictions that eventually add up to something irreversible. She is 23 when Red ends its formal commercial life. She has already begun writing the record that will follow it, and the record that will follow it will sound nothing like anything she has done before, because that is what she does. She finishes one thing completely enough to let it go, and then she walks without looking back into whatever comes next. What comes next is something she is not yet prepared for. A cultural moment so large and so strange and so consuming that even her considerable capacity for control will prove insufficient against it. And the very qualities that have protected her most reliably will briefly become the things that expose her most completely. Chapter 40. Directing the pivot to pure pop. She sits in a rented studio in Stockholm in the winter of 2012, headphones clamped over her ears, and the sound that fills them is not a guitar. It is a synthesizer, cold, luminous, algorithmically precise, and something about it makes her go very still. The engineer on the other side of the glass watches her face. He has seen musicians react to demos in every conceivable way: indifference, polite enthusiasm, the performative nod. What he sees now is different. Her eyes close. Her chin lifts a fraction of an inch. It is the expression of someone who has just heard a door open in a room she did not know existed. She has been here before, in studios that smelled of someone else's ambition. But this time, she is not writing her way back to something familiar. She is writing her way toward something she cannot yet name. The year is 2012, and Taylor Swift is 22 years old, and she is in the middle of dismantling everything that made her famous. To understand what she is doing in Stockholm, and why it matters, you have to understand what the music industry looked like in that particular window of time, and what it meant to be Taylor Swift inside it. The early 2010s were years of seismic restructuring in popular music. Streaming had not yet completed its hostile takeover of the industry's revenue model, but it had cracked the foundation. Album sales were declining. Radio formats were collapsing into one another. Country music, which had sheltered Swift through her ascent, was itself undergoing an identity crisis, torn between its traditionalist base and the crossover ambitions of a new generation of artists who had grown up listening to Shania Twain and discovering that pop and country were not, in fact, mutually exclusive categories. Swift had released Speak Now in 2010 to enormous commercial success, debuting at #1 and certifying her as something the industry rarely produces, a genuine phenomenon who had written every song on her album alone. Critics admired the craftsmanship. Fans bought the record in numbers that made label executives briefly forget their anxieties about the streaming apocalypse. But Swift was already restless in a way that those sales figures could not capture. She had accomplished with Speak Now something close to the perfection of a particular form, the confessional country pop album, emotionally direct, melodically generous, structurally familiar. And the moment you perfect a form is the moment it begins to feel like a cage. The album that would become Red was already gestating in her notebook, in fragments and half-phrases that she scribbled on hotel stationery between tour dates. It was louder than anything she had made before. Angrier. More interested in the texture of feeling than in its resolution. She began pulling in collaborators she had never worked with, Max Martin, Shellback, Dan Wilson. And what emerged from those sessions was something that made her country label Big Machine Records quietly nervous. The records were good. They were undeniably, commercially, sonically good. But they were not entirely country. They were not entirely anything. They lived in the spaces between categories, which is artistically interesting and commercially terrifying. Red arrived in October 2012, and immediately became the subject of a classification debate that Swift found both flattering and slightly absurd. Country stations played some of it. Pop stations played more of it. The single, We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together, which she co-wrote with Martin and Shellback, and which opens with a spoken word aside so conversational it sounds like a text message read aloud, went to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was the fastest rising single in the chart's history at that point. And it sounded almost nothing like the girl who had stood on a stage in Nashville in 2006 and sung about a boy in the bleachers. But here's what the classification debate missed, and what the sales figures obscured. Red was not Swift's arrival at pop music. It was her reconnaissance mission. She was scouting the territory, testing the acoustics, learning the grammar of a genre she had decided she wanted to speak fluently rather than with a country accent. The album's own internal inconsistency, its lurches between banjo-tinged heartbreak and Max Martin's crystalline synthetic sheen, was not a failure of artistic vision. It was evidence of a mind in the act of changing itself. The core conflict she faced during this period was not external, though it would eventually manifest as external pressure. It was the conflict between institutional loyalty and creative necessity. Swift had been made, in a very literal sense, by country music. Scott Borchetta had signed her to Big Machine when she was 14. Nashville had given her the infrastructure of her career. The radio relationships, the touring circuit, the critical vocabulary with which she was understood. To leave country music was not simply a genre shift. It was an act of institutional departure that carried with it the weight of perceived ingratitude, the risk of alienating a fan base that had claimed her as specifically theirs, and the very real possibility that the pop audience, which is notoriously fickle and crowded with competition, would not receive her with the same devotion. The industry's concerns were expressed with the diplomatic vagueness that executives favor when they are actually frightened. There were conversations, careful ones, the kind conducted over meals rather than in conference rooms, about the importance of not confusing her audience. There were suggestions that a more gradual transition might be wise. There were references to other artists who had attempted similar pivots and found themselves stranded between constituencies, loved by neither. These conversations were not unreasonable. They were based on genuine historical precedent. And Swift listened to them with the attentiveness she brings to every conversation, which includes the attentiveness to know when she is being managed rather than advised. What happened next is, depending on your perspective, either a masterclass in creative autonomy or an act of radical stubbornness. Probably both. She went to Sweden. The decision to work with Max Martin and Shellback, Swedish producers who had constructed hit records for Britney Spears, Katy Perry, Kelly Clarkson, Robin, and a catalog of pop royalty that reads like a syllabus for the study of the contemporary mainstream, was not a casual one. Martin's studio in Stockholm operated according to a particular philosophy: songs should feel inevitable. They should unfold with the logic of something you have always known, even when you are hearing it for the first time. It was a philosophy that Swift recognized because it was also, in different terms, her own. She had always written songs that felt like they arrived rather than were constructed. What Martin's methodology offered was a new set of tools for achieving that quality of arrival in a sonic register she had not yet fully inhabited. The sessions were collaborative in the truest sense, which is to say, they were occasionally contentious. Swift's working method involves a kind of obsessive tinkering. She will chase a single syllable through 6 different melodies before she finds the one that settles. Martin's process is similarly meticulous, though it operates at the level of production rather than lyric. There were moments in those Stockholm rooms when 2 different perfectionist philosophies were in direct tension, each pulling the song toward its own vision of what the song should be. But it was in one of those sessions, a late afternoon in a room that smelled of coffee and circuit boards, that something clarifying happened. They were working on what would eventually become the scaffolding for her 5th album, still years away from a title or a release date. Martin played her a chord progression built almost entirely on synthesizer, stripped of any acoustic element, modern in the way that certain architecture is modern, clean to the point of austerity, confident in its refusal of ornament. He asked her what she heard in it. She did not answer immediately. She picked up a pen, she always picks up a pen, and she wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up and said, with the directness that people who work with her consistently describe as one of her most striking qualities, that she heard herself in it. Not the self she had been. The self she was becoming. It was a small moment, the kind that does not make its way into press releases or authorized biographies. But it was also the kind of moment on which entire artistic careers turn. She had made a decision. Not the announcement of a decision, that would come later with the deliberate orchestration she applies to all public communications, but the interior decision, the one that precedes the announcement the way lightning precedes thunder. The figure who did the most to make this decision feel livable, rather than merely thrilling, was not a producer or an executive. It was Lord, Ella Yelich O'Connor, the New Zealand teenager who was, at precisely this moment, constructing her own relationship to pop music from the outside in. Lord had not yet released Pure Heroine when Swift first encountered her music, but the spirit of what she was doing, the insistence on emotional authenticity inside a sonic framework that was undeniably, unapologetically synthetic, resonated with Swift in a way she found difficult to articulate and did not try to. What the relationship with Lord offered was something rarer than creative advice. It offered companionship in the specific loneliness of artistic reinvention. Both women were in the process of deciding who they would be on the other side of their breakthrough. Both were doing it in public, which is its own particular form of exposure. Their friendship, still in its early stages during this period, would deepen into something that looked from the outside like mutual admiration and felt from the inside, by all accounts, like the recognition of a shared temperament, fierce, private, constitutionally disinclined towards self-doubt despite every structural incentive to succumb to it. Lord would later describe Swift as someone who treats friendship with the same creative seriousness she brings to songwriting, which is either a beautiful thing or a slightly alarming one, depending on your relationship to intensity. What it meant in this period was that Swift had found, in an unexpected quarter, a kind of corroboration. The instinct she was following, toward synthesis, toward a pop idiom that did not require her to abandon her lyrical precision, was an instinct that another artist she respected was following in parallel. That parallel mattered. It does not determine a decision, but it can make a decision feel like less of a leap into darkness and more like a step in a direction that other intelligent people are also moving. By the end of 2012, the architecture of what would become 1989, still unnamed, still unannounced, still entirely private, was already beginning to form. She knew the album would be pure pop. She knew it would be produced primarily in collaboration with Martin and shellback. She knew it would require a rupture with country music so complete that it could not be framed as evolution, but only as departure. She knew all of this, and she was not frightened by it, in the way that the industry feared she should be. She was, if anything, energized by it, by the scale of the risk, by the specificity of the vision, by the particular pleasure of knowing something that no one else yet knows. What she did not yet know, could not have known in that Stockholm studio, with the synthesizer still ringing in the room and her notebook open on the table, was that the decision she had just made would set in motion a sequence of events she could not entirely control. The rupture she was planning with country music would be clean and successful, and critically celebrated in ways that would exceed even her own projections. But departure has a way of leaving things behind, and the things left behind have a way of reasserting themselves. The institutional loyalties she was preparing to outgrow, the relationships built on a version of herself she was about to retire, the mechanisms of ownership and control that governed her catalog, these were not problems she was thinking about in December 2012. She was thinking about the next song, the next sound, the architecture of the album she could already hear in its entirety, note by note, in the privacy of her own mind. The reckoning that was quietly accumulating in the background of all this creative ambition would arrive eventually, with a force she had not anticipated, and in a form she could not have predicted. But that is a story for later. For now, there is only the studio, and the synthesizer, and the sound of a future being assembled in the dark.